The night before everything changed, Sundar Pichai sat alone in his quiet home office, staring at an email invitation that most people in his position would have quickly ignored. It wasn't for a world summit or a billion-dollar deal, but for something smaller, something ordinary. A university in California had invited him to attend their technology fair as a guest. Students would present their projects, professors would mingle, and local business leaders would join. It was the kind of event where people hustled for attention, hoping to meet someone powerful. For Sundar, who was used to global headlines, it seemed almost too small. Yet he accepted because something inside him always remembered the days when he was just another student carrying big dreams in a crowded classroom. But Sundar did not arrive at the event in a limousine with security. He dressed in simple clothes, dark pants, a plain shirt, and an old jacket that had survived years of travel. He didn't want attention. He wanted to walk among the students unnoticed, to feel again what it was like to be just another dreamer. In a crowded hall, as he entered the university building, no one recognized him. To the busy organizers, he was not the CEO of Google. He was just another face in the crowd. The first blow came quickly. At the main hall entrance, a security guard glanced at him, frowned, and pointed to a mop leaning against the wall. "Hey, the cleaning staff needs to move their supplies out of the way. Grab that mop and bucket. Don't just stand there." Sundar froze for a second. He could have spoken up, could have said his name, and the misunderstanding would have ended instantly. But instead he looked at the mop. Something in him whispered that maybe this moment was a test not for him, but for the people around him. He quietly lifted the bucket and stepped aside. The guard barely gave him another look. Inside the hall, the atmosphere buzzed with ambition. Bright screens flickered, students nervously rehearsed their pitches, and professors gathered in tight circles. Sundar walked slowly, observing. But he noticed eyes following him, not with respect, but with suspicion. One professor whispered, "Strange. Why is the janitor wandering here during setup?" A student laughed. "Maybe he wants to see the robots clean better than he does." The words stung more than Sundar expected. For a man who had built a life on humility, it shouldn't have mattered. Yet it did. He thought of his mother back in India, who had once told him, "Never let success blind you, Sundar. One day, the world will forget your titles, and all they will see is the way you treat others." As the event began, Sundar quietly helped students plug in cables, carried an extra chair for a nervous young girl, and even cleaned up spilled coffee on the floor. People continued to assume he was part of the janitorial staff. Some ignored him, some gave him sharp commands, and a few even mocked him. Then came the most humiliating moment. On stage, before the main presentation, the event host called out names of special guests. Billionaires, CEOs, and investors received applause. When it came to Sundar, his name was missing. Instead, as he walked past the side of the stage to take a seat, a group of students pointed at him and laughed. "Look at the janitor trying to sit with the VIP guests. Someone tell him he doesn't belong here." The laughter echoed louder than the clapping in the hall. Sundar's face burned. He stayed quiet. Inside, however, a storm began to build. He was not angry for himself. He had endured worse in life, but for what this moment revealed. How quickly people judged. How easily they dismissed a man by his clothes, his silence, his simplicity. Sundar sat in the corner of the hall, still. Unnoticed, his mind raced. Should he reveal who he was and silence the crowd? Or should he wait, watch, and let the night unfold to show everyone the deeper truth? And just as he was wrestling with that thought, a young student nervously approached him. "Sir," the boy whispered, "I know you're not really a janitor. I've seen your face in the news. You're Sundar Pichai, aren't you?" Sundar looked at the boy, his eyes narrowing in surprise. Before he could answer, the host announced on stage, "Ladies and gentlemen, our final surprise. Guest has just arrived. Please welcome the CEO of Google, Sundar Pichai." Every head turned toward the main entrance. People clapped wildly as cameras flashed, but Sundar was not at the door. He was still sitting quietly in the corner, dressed like a janitor, watching the hall erupt in confusion. The real shock was only about to begin. Asterisk, the applause thundered across the hall, echoing like a storm breaking loose, and for a moment it felt as though the entire building shook under the weight of so many hands clapping. Students stood on chairs, waving their phones in the air, hoping to capture a glimpse of the famous man they believed had just walked in. Professors craned their necks, smiling with pride, eager to boast later that they had shared the same room with the CEO of Google. Investors straightened their ties, already imagining the networking opportunity that lay ahead. But amid this frenzy of excitement, Sundar sat quietly in the corner, the mop bucket still near his feet, his plain jacket draped over the chair. He was not at the entrance where all eyes were focused. Instead, another man, dressed in a sharp designer suit, walked confidently into the spotlight, waving as though the applause belonged to him. The air seemed to split into two realities. One where people believed the guest of honor had arrived, and another where the real man they sought sat unnoticed, invisible to the crowd, their applause a cruel irony. Sundar leaned back slightly, watching with calm eyes, though inside, his thoughts moved like a river in flood. Who was this man, and why did he step into a role that wasn't his? The impostor walked with certainty, shaking hands, smiling wide, enjoying the admiration showered upon him. It was as if the universe had conspired to test the very limits of humility and patience in Sundar's heart. The young student who had recognized him tugged gently at Sundar's sleeve. "Sir, what are you going to do?" "They think that man is you." His voice trembled, caught between awe and fear, as though he alone bore the weight of the truth. Sundar didn't answer right away. He watched the impostor approach the stage, watched how easily the crowd accepted him. A man's worth, it seemed, was decided not by his heart, not by his deeds, but by his suit, his polished shoes, his outward glow dot, and yet Sundar felt no rush to expose the truth. He remembered his father's words from long ago in their modest home in India. A man's strength is not in how quickly he corrects others, but in how patiently he lets them reveal themselves. So Sundar chose silence, at least for now. The impostor introduced himself to the host, who nearly stumbled over words in excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host announced proudly, "please welcome the man who needs no introduction, the CEO of Google, Mr. Sundar Pichai." The cheers grew louder, a wave of sound that almost drowned out reason. Sundar felt the sting in his chest, not because his name was stolen, but because the people who had mocked him moments ago now bent their backs in reverence to a stranger who merely looked the part. The same students who had laughed at him for carrying a mop were now desperate to shake the hand of the impostor. The same professor who had whispered cruel words earlier now leaned forward eagerly, notebook ready, as though every syllable from the fake Sundar's mouth would be golden dot the real Sundar could taste. The bitter irony in the air. He thought of the spilled coffee he had cleaned earlier, the chair he had carried, the wires he had untangled for students. No one had thanked him then. Yet now, for a man in a suit who had done nothing, gratitude overflowed. The young student spoke again, his voice firmer this time. "Sir, if you don't say something, they'll never know the truth. They'll go home thinking that man was you?" Sundar finally turned his gaze to the boy, his dark eyes calm but piercing. "Sometimes the truth doesn't need to be told right away," he said softly. "Sometimes it needs to be shown." On stage, the impostor began speaking. He repeated common phrases about innovation, about hard work, about dreams, words so shallow they felt like borrowed lines from a motivational book. Yet the audience nodded eagerly, some even taking notes. Sundar noticed the emptiness behind the man's eyes, the way he shifted uncomfortably when asked a deeper question about technology. The impostor's answers were vague, evasive, lacking. The knowledge Sundar carried like second nature whispers slowly began spreading among the more observant students. "Does he really sound like Sundar Pichai? I thought his voice was different." Another added, "Why does he keep dodging technical questions?" But the louder majority, swept away by appearances, silenced the doubts. The impostor raised his hand dramatically and declared, Google's future is built on speed, on moving fast without worrying about mistakes. Risks are for the bold. The hall erupted in applause again, yet Sundar felt his heart tighten. Those words were the opposite of what he believed. He had always taught his teams patience, careful thought, humility, and innovation. Here was a man distorting his values in front of hundreds, and the crowd swallowed the lie eagerly. Sundar leaned forward. His fingers clasped together, the storm inside him reaching its breaking point. He thought of the janitor's mop, the laughter, the humiliation, the betrayal of truth playing out on stage. But then he thought of something greater. What would happen if he revealed himself now? What would this moment teach? As the impostor's speech dragged on, Sundar rose slowly from his chair. The young student's eyes widened, and he whispered, Are you going to stop him? Sundar didn't answer. He began walking forward, the crowd still focused on the stage, their backs turned to the man in plain clothes making his way quietly through the hall. He passed by the professors who had mocked him, by the students who had laughed, by the investors who hadn't given him a second glance. None recognized him, even now. He stopped just a few feet away from the stage, where the impostor basked in the glow of false applause. Sundar's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, silence filled the air, as though the universe itself held its breath, waiting for what would come next. Then, the impostor smiled too widely at a question he couldn't answer and looked directly at Sundar standing in the crowd. Their eyes met. Something flickered in the impostor's face, fear, recognition, or perhaps the realization that the man he had tried to impersonate was right there, watching him. The host, sensing something strange, turned toward where Sundar stood and frowned. Sir, the host called, confused. Are you part of the staff here? Could you please move to the back? The hall chuckled, some laughing again at the supposed janitor interrupting the moment. The impostor shifted nervously, sweat beginning to shine on his forehead. Sundar took one slow step forward, then another. His voice finally broke the silence, calm yet powerful. I have a question for the man on stage, he said, that the crowd turned toward him, irritated at first, but then hushed. Something in his tone carried weight, a quiet authority that made even the laughter die. The impostor's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone. Go ahead, he said, trying to sound confident. Sundar's eyes locked onto his. If you're truly who you say you are, tell us. What was the very first product I ever worked on when I joined Google? The hall fell silent. The impostor froze, mouth half open, eyes darting left and right. The truth was about to explode like a fire in the room. Asterisk the silence that followed. Sundar's question was heavier than any applause that had filled the hall. Earlier, it pressed against the walls, crept into the hearts of everyone in the room, and stretched across the seconds until even the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed too loud. Hundreds of faces turned toward the man on stage, expecting an answer that should have come instantly if he were truly the CEO of Google. But the impostor's lips trembled, and his eyes flickered with panic. He swallowed hard, clutched the microphone tighter, and tried to force a smile that looked more like a grimace. Well, you see, he stammered, his voice breaking slightly. When I first joined, there were so many projects, it's difficult to recall just one specific product. His words fell flat. The crowd, once dazzled by his confidence, now shifted uneasily. Students whispered to one another, some glancing back at Sundar, who stood quietly in the aisle, his plain jacket and simple clothes suddenly carrying a weight no designer suit could match. A professor muttered under his breath, That's odd. Sundar Pichai would never forget his first product. Another nodded slowly, realizing that doubt was spreading like cracks in glass. Sundar took another step forward, his eyes never leaving the impostor. You don't remember? His voice was soft, almost gentle, but the calmness only deepened the sting. Then perhaps I can help remind you. It was the Google toolbar. I worked tirelessly on it when I first joined. It may have seemed small to the world, but it was the foundation of everything that followed. And I remember every sleepless night, every line of feedback, every doubt we had to overcome. Gasps rippled through the hall. The imposter's face drained of color. The truth had been spoken, not in arrogance, but in quiet certainty, with the kind of detail that only the real Sundar could ever know. The host looked back and forth between the imposter and Sundar, his hands trembling as he held the microphone. Wait, are you saying... His voice trailed off, too overwhelmed to finish the sentence. The imposter tried to laugh, but it came out choked. Anyone could have known that, he argued weakly, his tone desperate. The toolbar was public knowledge. It doesn't prove anything. But Sundar didn't raise his voice or argue further. Instead, he walked closer, each step deliberate, each moment more unbearable for the imposter. You're right, Sundar said. Knowledge can be copied. Words can be rehearsed, but experience cannot be faked. So let me ask you something else. The crowd leaned forward, holding their breath. When I was a child in India, Sundar continued, his voice softening as memory filled his tone. My family didn't own a phone. When we finally got one, it was a rotary dial phone, heavy and simple. I remember being a boy and running my fingers over the numbers again and again, fascinated by how pressing those buttons could connect us to the world. That memory, that simple piece of technology, planted the seed that grew into everything I am today. Tell me, he asked the imposter, his eyes piercing, do you remember that phone? The imposter froze. His lips moved soundlessly, but no answer came. The hall erupted into murmurs, disbelief turning into certainty. The man in the plain jacket, the one mocked as a janitor, had spoken with a truth so personal, so raw, that no fraud could imitate it. The host's hand shook as he lowered the microphone away from the imposter and turned to Sundar. Sir, are you saying you are Sundar Pichai? Before Sundar could respond, a group of students who had mocked him earlier now stood up, their faces pale with shock. One of them whispered, almost to himself, It's really him. All this time, we thought he was a janitor. The imposter dropped the microphone with a loud clang that echoed through the hall. Sweat poured down his forehead. His shoulders slumped, and he muttered something inaudible before trying to slip off the stage. But the crowd, once dazzled by his false confidence, now parted their gaze from him as though he were nothing. All attention turned to the quiet man who had carried a mop, who had cleaned spilled coffee, who had endured humiliation without once raising his voice. Sundar slowly climbed the steps to the stage, the sound of his footsteps louder than thunder in the stunned silence. When he reached the center, he didn't face the imposter. Instead, he turned toward the audience, his expression calm but filled with something deeper, a mixture of sorrow, strength, and quiet disappointment. Tonight, he began, his voice steady. You saw how easily appearances can deceive. You judged me when I carried a mop. You laughed when I sat in the corner. You dismissed me because of what I wore. And yet, the moment you saw a man in a suit, you handed him your respect, your trust, your admiration, without asking if he deserved it. His words cut through the air, each one heavy with truth. Students lowered their heads in shame. Professors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Investors stared at the floor, unwilling to meet his gaze. Sundar paused, letting the silence linger. Before he continued, true respect is not given because of a title or a suit or a stage. It is earned through actions, through humility, through the way you treat others when you think they are less than you. Tonight, you didn't just mistake me for someone else. You revealed how quick we all are to judge. Tears welled in the eyes of the young student who had recognized him earlier. He whispered, I knew it was you, but I didn't know how to tell them. Sundar gave the boy a small nod, acknowledging his courage. Then he turned back to the crowd. This isn't about me, he said. It's about what each of us chooses to see in others. Do we see worth only in wealth and appearances? Or do we see dignity in every human being, no matter who they are? The hall was silent. No one moved. No one dared breathe too loudly. Sundar's words carried not just authority, but a mirror reflecting every person's weakness back at them. And then, just as the weight of truth seemed to settle, the impostor, still standing at the edge of the stage, suddenly shouted, his voice breaking with bitterness, "You think you're better than me because you're rich and powerful? You don't know what it's like to be invisible, to be ignored, to be treated as nothing?" The hall gasped, shocked by the outburst. Sundar turned slowly to face him, his expression unreadable. For the first time, the impostor's voice carried a strange kind of raw honesty, a glimpse of pain hidden beneath the lies. And in that moment, everyone realized the story wasn't over. Asterisk, the impostor's words sliced through the silence, like broken glass, sharp and unexpected. The crowd, which had been holding its breath in awe of Sundar's calm authority, suddenly shifted uneasily, as though a hidden truth had just surfaced from the shadows. The man's face was twisted, his suit damp with sweat, but his eyes carried a strange fire. He was no longer just a fraud caught in the act, he was a man exposing his wounds, his bitterness, his long years of feeling small in a world that worshiped power and names. "You think I wanted to stand here and lie?" The impostor shouted, his voice shaking between anger and desperation. No one remembers the man who works in the corner office without a title. No one listens to the one who sweeps the floor or carries the weight behind the scenes. The world looks at you, Sundar, and bows because of your position, but men like me, we are invisible. We are laughed at, ignored, tossed aside. Tonight, I wanted to be seen. Just once, I wanted to feel what it's like to matter. The hall went dead silent. Every word hung heavy in the air, pressing down on the hearts of the students, the professors, and the investors alike. Some lowered their heads, ashamed, because deep down they knew his anger wasn't entirely without truth. How often had they themselves dismissed someone by appearance, by role, by class? How often had they placed value only where status glittered? Sundar stood still, his calm presence forming a sharp contrast against the trembling impostor. His eyes softened as he studied the man, not with scorn, but with a quiet, almost fatherly compassion. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the steadiness of stone and the gentleness of rain. "You say you are invisible," Sundar began slowly, his words echoing across the hall. "But tonight, every eye in this room is on you. Not because you wore a suit, not because you stole my name, but because you spoke your pain aloud. And in that pain, you revealed something we all need to hear." The impostor blinked, confused by the lack of anger in Sundar's tone. The crowd shifted again, leaning forward, caught between the sharp edge of tension and the surprising warmth in Sundar's response. "You are right about one thing," Sundar continued, his voice gaining quiet strength. "The world too often ignores the ones who do the unseen work. We walk past the janitor, the cook, the driver, the clerk, and we do not see their dreams, their struggles, their humanity. But let me tell you something I have not forgotten. I have been that man. I have been the boy who was overlooked, the student who was doubted, the immigrant who was underestimated. I know what it feels like when no one sees you. But invisibility is not the same as worthlessness. Your worth is not given by others. It is within you." Gasps rippled softly through the hall. Sundar's words didn't just answer the impostor. They pierced through the walls of pride and prejudice that every person carried inside. A professor who had mocked Sundar earlier now wiped his eyes behind his glasses. A student who had laughed at him with the mop felt her throat tighten, her chest heavy with regret. The impostor, however, shook his head violently. "Easy for you to say," he shouted bitterly. "You stand there with billions behind your name, with people listening to every word you speak. You can afford humility, but what about men like me? No one listens to us until we pretend to be someone greater." For a moment, Sundar was silent again, as though weighing his answer carefully. The crowd waited, their hearts pounding. Finally, he stepped closer to the impostor, his voice lowering, yet carrying more power than a shout. "Do you think my journey was built on billions? When I first left India, I had almost nothing. I lived in a room so small that I could hear my neighbors breathed through the walls. I ate plain meals, wore second-hand clothes, and worked harder than I thought possible, often wondering if I would ever be noticed. There were nights I wanted to give up, nights I felt like you feel now small, invisible, unimportant. But I didn't chase importance by pretending to be someone else. I built it step by step with honesty, patience, and resilience. I never forgot who I was. His words rang with truth so raw that even the imposter's shoulders sagged under its weight. The anger in his eyes flickered, replaced by something else, something fragile, something almost like shame. Sundar placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, a gesture that shocked the audience even more than his words. "You don't need my name to matter," Sundar said softly. "You don't need this stage, or this crowd, or this suit. Your story, your pain, your work, it matters because it is yours. But when you steal, when you deceive, when you wear a mask, you don't just fool others, you rob yourself of the chance to be seen for who you truly are." The imposter's lips trembled. For the first time, tears welled in his eyes. He looked down at the stage floor, the weight of his choices pressing down harder than the shame of being caught. The audience was motionless, their own reflections swirling in their minds. Many realized how easily they had been swayed by a suit, how quickly. They had dismissed the man with the mop. Some wanted to cry, some wanted to apologize, but no one dared break the silence that had become sacred in that moment. Then Sundar turned back to the crowd, his hand still resting gently on the imposter's shoulder. This is not just his story, he declared, his voice carrying like a wave through the hall. This is our story. Every time we choose appearance over truth, every time we give respect only to power and not to kindness, we repeat the same mistake you all made tonight. The question is, will we keep repeating it, or will we change? The hall erupted in a stunned quiet, as though the weight of a collective soul had been laid bare. Students wiped their eyes. Professors shifted with guilt. Even investors who had walked in with arrogance now looked shaken. Their pride cracked open. But just when it seemed the night had reached its deepest truth, the imposter suddenly dropped to his knees in front of Sundar. His voice broke into a sob as he cried, "I'm sorry. I just wanted to be seen. I just wanted to feel important, even for one night." And as those words echoed, Sundar bent down slightly, his face unreadable, about to answer in a way that no one expected. Asterisk, the imposter's knees hit the stage floor with a hollow thud that echoed in the hall, a sound that carried more weight than any word he had spoken earlier. His head hung low, his suit wrinkled, his polished shoes no longer gleaming under the spotlight. The crowd stared in shock, their eyes wide, their hands frozen mid-clap, mid-note, mid-breath. A man who moments ago had stood tall, pretending to be someone greater, now knelt exposed and trembling, his mask shattered before hundreds. Sundar looked down at him, silent. In that silence, the world seemed to pause. The imposter's sobs filled the air, raw and broken, carrying years of buried pain. "I'm sorry," he choked out again. "I only wanted to matter. I only wanted someone to look at me and not see nothing." His voice cracked on the last word, and it rolled through the audience like a haunting melody, striking chords of guilt in every heart present. The students who had laughed at Sundar earlier exchanged nervous glances, their shame written on their faces. The professors who had whispered cruel words shifted uncomfortably, remembering how quickly they had dismissed the quiet man with the mop. Investors who had measured worth only in suits and titles felt their pride crumble in the presence of such vulnerability. For the first time that night, the imposter was not invisible. Every eye was on him, not for the lie he told, but for the truth he could no longer hide. And still Sundar stood silent, his face unreadable. But inside, his heart wrestled with the weight of the moment. He could humiliate the man further, prove once and for all how foolish the world had been to fall for appearances. He could let the imposter drown in shame, a lesson etched in pain. Yet another voice whispered within him, the voice of his mother, gentle but firm, true strength. "My son is not in striking others down, but in lifting them up when they expect it, least." Finally, Sundar bent down, his plain jacket brushing against the polished stage floor. He lowered himself until his eyes were level with the imposter's, and for the first time, his expression softened to something unmistakably human compassion. He placed a hand lightly on the man's shoulder, steadying him as though lifting part of the burden. "Stand up," Sundar said quietly. The words were simple, but they rang with such authority that the entire hall seemed to lean in closer. The imposter shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face. "No, I don't deserve to stand. I lied. I stole your name. I mocked your worth with my falsehood. Let me kneel here and take whatever punishment comes." But Sundar's grip on his shoulder tightened just slightly, steady but kind. "Listen to me," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of truth. "You want it to matter. But kneeling in shame will not give you dignity. Standing up, owning your mistake, and choosing a different path, that is where dignity is. And no man becomes visible by pretending to be someone else. You become visible when you dare to be yourself." The imposter's sobs slowed, his breathing ragged, his body trembling under the weight of those words. Slowly, shakily, he began to rise, guided not by force, but by Sundar's quiet encouragement. The sight stunned the audience. Here was the CEO of Google, the man mocked as a janitor only hours before, helping the fraud who had humiliated him to stand tall again. A murmur spread through the crowd, some gasping, some crying silently, all of them moved by the unexpected turn. The same students who had once ridiculed Sundar now felt tears sting their eyes. The professors who had dismissed him struggled to find words. Even the investors, hardened by years of chasing profit, felt something stir in their chests, a reminder that humanity was worth more than appearances or titles. When the imposter finally stood, his head still hung in shame. Sundar, however, placed a hand over his heart and looked directly into his eyes. "You are not nothing," Sundar said firmly, his voice resonating through the hall. "You made a mistake. But a mistake does not erase your worth. What matters now is what you choose to do next. Will you let this moment define you in shame, or will you use it to begin again?" The imposter's lips trembled as he whispered, "But how do I begin again when everyone here has seen me at my worst?" Sundar turned then to the crowd, his gaze sweeping across the sea of faces, many streaked with tears and heavy with regret. "Then, perhaps," he said slowly, "the lesson is not only for him, but for all of us. Each of you laughed, dismissed, or ignored when you thought I was just a janitor. Each of you placed your trust in a suit, in an image, in an illusion. Tonight, we all saw our weakness. Tonight, we all have a choice. Will we keep judging by appearances, or will we begin to look deeper to see the value in every human being?" The hall was still, the weight of his words pressing against every soul. No one dared speak, for they knew he was not only addressing the imposter, but each of them. The truth had become a mirror, and every person saw their reflection in it. Young student who had first recognized Sundar stood slowly, his small voice breaking the silence. "Sir, you matter, not because of your title, but because of who you are. And I think he matters too because he finally told the truth." His words, though trembling, struck with surprising force. The audience murmured, many nodding through. Their tears. Sundar gave the boy a small nod of gratitude, then looked back at the imposter. "You wanted to be seen," he said softly. "Well, now you are. Not as me, but as yourself, a man who is brave enough to admit his pain and his mistake. And that, my friend, is where true respect begins." The imposter's tears flowed anew, but this time they were different. Not only of shame, but of release of a burden finally lifted. And just as the hall seemed to be settling into reflection, a deep voice rose from the back, firm, authoritative, and filled with unease. "Mr. Pichai, with all due respect," the voice said, "this man impersonated you. He lied to hundreds of people. Forgiveness is one thing, but are you truly going to let him walk away without consequences?" The crowd turned, eyes widening as a group of university trustees and business leaders stepped forward, their faces stern. The tension surged again, twisting the air tight. It seemed the night was not finished testing Sundar, nor the lessons. Yet complete. Asterisk, the words from the trustees cut through the hall like a blade. Forgiveness is one thing, the man repeated, his voice sharp, but letting this impostor walk away freely sets a dangerous precedent. He deceived us, he embarrassed this institution, and he disrespected your name, our pichai. Surely there must be consequences. The crowd stirred again, whispers swelling like a restless tide. Some nodded in agreement, their sense of order demanding punishment. Others shifted uneasily, torn between justice and the strange, unexpected mercy they had just witnessed. The impostor, still trembling beside Sundar, lowered his head once more, his brief hope of redemption collapsing under the heavy gavel of authority. All eyes turned back to Sundar. He stood still at the center of the stage, the mop bucket still faintly visible in the corner like a ghost of the humiliation that had started it all. His plain jacket, his quiet eyes, his calm presence, everything about him stood in stark contrast to the storm of judgment brewing around him. For a moment, it seemed as though the weight of both mercy and justice had been placed squarely on his shoulders. He breathed deeply before speaking, his voice carrying across the hall with a clarity that silenced the whispers. "You are right," Sundar began, his tone steady. "There must be consequences for deception. Trust is fragile, and lies can shatter it in an instant. This man's actions cannot be dismissed as though they never happened. But consequences do not always mean punishment. Sometimes the greatest consequence is to face the truth and be transformed by it." The trustees frowned, unconvinced. "And what transformation could possibly come from this?" one of them demanded. "He impersonated you, stole your name, and made a mockery of this event. Surely you don't mean to reward him." Sundar turned, his gaze slowly across the hall, letting his eyes linger on each row of students, professors, investors, and finally the impostor beside him. "Tonight, he is not the only one who failed," Sundar said firmly. "All of you failed as well. You laughed when you thought I was just a janitor. You dismissed me when you thought I was unimportant. You placed respect not in humanity, but in appearance. This man may have lied, but the rest of you believed the lie without question. Is he the only one deserving of consequences?" His words struck like lightning. The hall fell silent, as though the entire room had been caught in. A mirror reflecting its own flaws, heads lowered. Guilt swelled in the air like a heavy fog. For the first time, the trustees themselves faltered, their stern expressions softening under the undeniable truth. Sundar paused, his silence deliberate, before continuing. "If I punish him while you all go free, then this lesson is wasted. Punishment should not come from humiliation. It should come from change. So here is what I propose. He will not walk away without consequence. He will stand before you, not as an impostor, but as himself, and share his true story. And you, all of you, will listen. Because for once the man who claimed he was invisible will finally be seen." The impostor lifted his head slowly, his eyes wide with disbelief. You want me to speak?" he whispered. Sundar nodded. "Speak your truth. Not my story, not anyone else's. Yours." The trustees hesitated, but the room had shifted. The students leaned forward, the professors sat upright, the investors lowered their defenses. Curiosity and remorse now bound them together, eager to hear the voice they had dismissed. The impostor stepped shakily to the microphone. His voice trembled at first, but soon steadied as the weight of honesty carried him. He spoke of his life, of growing up poor, of being overlooked in every job he held, of watching men in suits pass him by while he felt trapped in shadows. He spoke of the desperation that drove him to pretend, to taste for one night what it felt like to matter. His words were not polished or grand, but they were raw, honest, and dripping with humanity. And for the first time that evening, the hall was not filled with laughter or applause or judgment. It was filled with listening. True listening. When he finished, his shoulders slumped, but his eyes carried a new light. He was still broken, but no longer invisible. Sundar placed a hand on his shoulder once more. Your consequence, he said softly, is that you can no longer hide in the shadows of lies. Tonight, you were seen. Now it is your responsibility to live worthy of that truth. The hall erupted not in applause, but in a standing silence. People rose to their feet, not clapping, but bowing their heads, acknowledging the weight of what they had witnessed. The trustees themselves stood unable to argue against what they had just experienced. A professor wiped tears from his eyes and whispered, "We came here for technology, but we leave with humanity." Sundar looked out over the crowd one last time, his words carrying the final lesson. Never judge a man by his clothes or his title or the power you think he holds. Judge him by his actions, by his kindness, by his resilience. Respect is not something you give to appearances. It is something you give to people, all people. Tonight, you saw the danger of forgetting that. I hope you will never forget it again. The hall remained silent, every heart heavy, every mind awakened. Sundar stepped back from the microphone, not with triumph, but with humility. The mop bucket in the corner, once a symbol of his humiliation, now stood as a reminder of the night when appearances crumbled. And truth, humility, and respect took center stage. The impostor, once broken, now stood straighter, not because he had been forgiven, but because he had been seen. The students, professors, and investors filed out slowly, each carrying the lesson carved deep into their souls, Dot and Sundar. The CEO, who had been mistaken for a janitor, left the stage, not as the man who had been humiliated, but as the man who had reminded the world what true dignity meant. Asterisk.